Hey everyone, welcome to the 7th series of Esoteric Words from Logic of Sense by Gilles Deleuze. In this chapter, Deleuze continues his exploration of the serial form begun in the last chapter, a form in which he says is always realized by two different series. Deleuze loves to categorize things, so in this chapter he'll categorize how different series relate to each other, and he also introduces his concept of disjunctive synthesis, a concept he explores in more detail later on in the book. But from the categories he gives here, we start to get an idea of what he means by disjunctive synthesis. Deleuze begins this chapter by saying that Lewis Carroll explored and established the serial form. And he'll jump right into his first category, which is two series of events with slight internal differences regulated by a strange object. And he'll give an example, which is from Sylvie and Bruno by Lewis Carroll, part 1, chapter 23, which features a magic watch, which doesn't follow time. It's an 8-handed watch. Doesn't follow time, rather time follows it. So a series of events or an event can happen, and the characters in Sylvie and Bruno can wind the hands back and replay the event again. So this is the series, this event is slightly different. It happens again, but it's slightly different. What regulates the two series of events, the first time it happens in time and then the second time, etc., is the watch. The magic watch is the strange object that regulates these two series. The next category he goes into is two series of events with great internal and accelerated differences. And again, he'll give some examples from Sylvie and Bruno. The one that I relate most to is in Sylvie and Bruno, there's always a series that concerns the fairy world, the world of magic, and another series that concerns the real world, our everyday world. And Deleuze will say that these two different words, you'll see in the story how a proposition will lead from one world into another. This is how these two greatly different worlds connect with each other. And what he means by accelerated differences is that this starts to get into his concept of just disjunctive synthesis, which is not it's kind of the opposite of a conjunctive synthesis. In other words, it's not a synthesis bringing things together. It's a synthesis, but things are going further apart from each other from the series of the events that whatever you're talking about. And so in other words, it's a synthesis of differences rather than a synthesis of similar things. The next category of the duality of series that Deleuze examines is between two series of propositions, or rather, what he says, between a series of propositions and a series of consumptions. And this goes back to the duality of events and bodies. Bodies consume things, or language and bodies. And he'll say that these kinds of series are characterized by great disparity, and they're regulated by an esoteric word. And before going on about the esoteric words, he mentions the French medieval writer Rabelais, and the Irish Jonathan Swift, both of them master satirists in their own right. He'll say that they had different procedures for these kinds of things. And I'll just mention that both of those writers had a strong influence on James Joyce, and James Joyce will come up again, sort of. He will come up again at the end of this chapter. But Deleuze will say that Lewis Carroll's esoteric words are a little bit different, and Deleuze will begin a typology of these esoteric words that regulate the two series of propositions and consumptions, or he also calls them two series. One can be denotation and expression. The first type of esoteric word Deleuze talks about is that where it's a word that's an entire proposition contracted into a single word. So his example is from Sylvie and Bruno, where the phrase "Your Royal Highness" is contracted into this single word, "Your Highness," "Your Highness." It's spelled Y-R'-IENCE, a single word meant to convey "Your Royal Highness." Deleuze will say that esoteric words in Lewis Carroll belong to a synthesis of coexistence intended to guarantee the conjunction of heterogeneous propositions. In other words, he's trying to make connections with sense between two different series of propositions. Deleuze will say that the best example of an esoteric word is the word snark, which he says circulates between the series of nourishment and the series of expression, the series of bodies and the series of events. And he'll say that this word, which circulates between these two kinds of series, is a blank word. In other words, the word snark is not the circulating word which circulates between these two series. The word snark is what that word is called. And we're getting into a little more confusing realm, in my opinion, if you just read it from logic of sense. However, I highly recommend reading The Hunting of the Snark by Lewis Carroll. It's not a long poem, and it will help make a lot more sense to what he's talking about this blank word that circulates. The circulating word is of a different nature. It's the empty square, the empty shelf, the blank word. So we talked about this in the last chapter of the empty place in the signifier series. And he'll say that this circulating word is called by names which indicate evanescences and displacement, or by names quite indeterminate like a liquid, it, that, thing, gadget, whatchamacallit. These are all different ways to call the blank word which circulates between these two kinds of series. Or he'll say also that the circulating word can have no name. There's nothing to call the circulating word. Rather, the circulating word can be the entire refrain of a song. And again, if you read The Hunting of the Snark, you'll see what he means by that. There's a refrain that's repeated in all the different sections of The Hunting of the Snark. And this, he says, is an example of the circulating word. And he'll point out that the snark is invisible. In the poem The Hunting of the Snark, you hear about the snark, and he turns up at the end, but we never actually see him or her or it. Okay, the next category of dual series he talks about, he says, are greatly ramified series regulated by a portmanteau word, contracting words. Portmanteau words are words which combine two different words into one. Snark, for example, is a portmanteau word. It's a combination of snake and shark. And Deleuze will go into detail on his definition of portmanteau words, because it's not just simply combining two words together. Deleuze has a distinct definition for portmanteau words. And for instance, he'll say that Although snark is a portmanteau word, he says that is only its secondary function. Its main function is to be this blank word that circulates between the series of nourishment and the series of expression. So there's a phrase very relevant to Kabbalists that Deleuze mentions that's important. He says, the problem is to know when portmanteau words become necessary, for one can always find portmanteau words. Almost all esoteric words may be thus interpreted. So in other words, how I interpreted the word proposition in series 3 when I said it could also be considered a proposition. I was breaking up that word and looking at it as a portmanteau word. But it's, as a Kabbalist knows, you need discernment to know which words to look at in that way, which has relevance to whatever it is you're examining or trying to do. It's in the description on portmanteau words where Deleuze first introduces his concept of disjunctive synthesis. He'll say that the function of a portmanteau word consists in ramification of the series into which it's inserted. He'll say that it seems that portmanteau words are always grounded in a disjunctive synthesis. He'll then give an excellent example of portmanteau words. He'll quote someone named Michel Butor, and the quote goes like this. Each of these words, meaning portmanteau words, can act as a switch, and we can move from one to another by means of many passages. Hence the idea of a book, which does not simply narrate one story, but a whole ocean of stories. Now, this quote is taken from an introduction to Finnegans Wake. So we're back to Joyce. James Joyce is central to this idea of a disjunctive synthesis, which is why I think he was brought up in the last chapter, series 6, which also correlates with the central sphere on the tree of life. Joyce is central to this project. And Deleuze ends this chapter by saying, the ramifying function or disjunctive synthesis is the real definition of a portmanteau words. Here we can see that what he means by disjunctive synthesis is somewhat equivalent to the ramifying function. And with that, we'll see you next time.